So let me read Mark 2 really quick. I'm going to try to read this as quickly as I can because I know it's a long chapter, not a long chapter, but it's 28 verses. So it says, when he returned to Capernaum after some days, it was reported that he was at home. So many gathered around that there was no longer room for them, not even in front of the door, and he was speaking the word to them. Then some people came, bringing to him a paralyzed man, carried by four of them. And when they could not bring him to Jesus because of the crowd, they removed the roof above him, and after having dug through it, they let down the mat on which the paralytic lay. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Now, some of the scribes were sitting there, questioning in their hearts, "Why does this fellow speak in this way? It is blasphemy. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" At once, Jesus perceived in his spirit that they were discussing these questions among themselves. And he said to them, "Why do you raise such questions in your hearts? Which is easier, to say to the paralytic, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Stand up and take your mat and walk'? But so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins," he said to the paralytic, "I say to you, stand up, take your mat, and go to your home." And he stood up and immediately took the mat, and went out before all of them, so that they were all amazed and glorified God, saying, "We have never seen anything like this." Verse 13. Jesus went out again beside the sea. The whole crowd gathered around him, and he taught them. As he was walking along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. And as he sat at dinner in Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were also sitting with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. When the scribes of the Pharisees saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, they said to his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" When Jesus heard this, he said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners." Verse 18. Now, John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and people came and said to him, "Why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" Jesus said to them, "The wedding guests cannot fast while the bridegroom is with them, can they? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast on that day. No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old cloak. Otherwise, the patch pulls away from it, the new from the old, and a worse tear is made. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is lost, and so are the skins. But one puts new wine into fresh wineskins." Last set of verses, starting from verse 23. One Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest, and ate bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priest to eat. And he gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.'" Sorry for that long. It's a whole chapter, right? So that's how we do it here, right? We do like many verses, rather than focusing on just one verse the whole time. Okay. Now, so I entitled this message "Going Against the Grain." Okay, going against the grain, and the radically rebellious Jesus, right? Because it looks like that's what you see in here, right? A Jesus who is actually what? Radically rebellious. And I think some of you here are pretty much a bunch of rebellious people, right? Okay. At least a lot of you here, okay? I'm assuming, right? Now, so so going against the grain, right? The radically rebellious Jesus. Now, the Jesus that we know from what we heard from the church is actually not the Jesus in Mark's gospel. Okay, the typical Jesus that we hear in churches, in many churches, not in all, but in many churches, right, is actually not the Jesus of the gospel. So, for example, in the church, what we have is more of a toned down Jesus. You have to do that, trying to cater to everyone, right? So, what you're going to do, you're going to try to what? You don't want to scare people, so you're going to try to what? You're going to try to tone it down. He looks like someone who is actually incapable of ruffling anyone's feathers. Right? That's actually the kind of Jesus that we get in churches today. Am I correct for actually making that kind of claim? In the church, Jesus is the guy who walked with peace and humility. Right? In the church, Jesus is the law-abiding citizen. Okay? In the church, Jesus is the one who is comfortable with the status quo and social norms. That's pretty much the Jesus that we get in churches, in a lot of churches today. In the church, Jesus is never the troublemaker. In the church, Jesus is the meek and some kind of a politically conservative American, something like that. That's at least how Jesus was actually what? Is always portrayed in churches today. If that's the Jesus that you know, then that's not the Jesus of what? Of the Gospel of Mark. Okay. Now, you only know the Jesus who has been domesticated to fit the contemporary sensibilities of the majority. Am I making sense here? We only know the Jesus who has been what? Domesticated to actually fit our own what? Sensibilities. That's the Jesus that we know. It is the Jesus who is somehow palatable to modern day Americans. That's what it is, right? That's the kind of Jesus that we know. But the attempts to make Jesus palatable to a modern day American are actually misleading. And I think it's mischaracterizing the Jesus of the gospel. Now, can I say that again? Right? I think that the attempts to make Jesus what? Palatable to us, in some sense, there's something misleading about that, about those attempts. There's something about those attempts that mischaracterize Jesus. Now, you are misled into thinking that, at least not you, but we are misled into thinking that Jesus was one who would be comfortable with the glamour of mega churches. Do you guys follow me here? No, I'm not saying I'm not going against mega churches. I used to attend Water of Life. We seem to think of Jesus as someone who will be comfortable with institutionalized Christianity. We seem to think of Jesus as someone who will be comfortable with the lures of materially prosperous life. That's the Jesus that we know. Okay. But in Mark's gospel, Jesus was what? Radically rebellious. He constantly challenged authorities. Constantly. Okay. He was a lawbreaker. And we will see that in the text that we read today. He abhors the status quo, right? And social norm. He was, like what I said a while ago, he was a troublemaker. He was the guy who violates, right, the religious sensibilities of his own culture. So in a way, he was like a Socratic gadfly. Right? Like Socrates trying to what? Create troubles all the time by the things that he says. He was someone who liked to ruffle someone's feathers. Now, he would be the Jesus that many of us would not like if he were actually what? Physically on earth today. We will actually not like him because I think he's going to make us feel uncomfortable, right? We generally do not like people who do things differently. But Jesus always what? Did things differently. That's just how he did it, right? I want you to be, in some sense, be repelled by Jesus here when you actually look at Mark 2. Right? Because that should bring some kind of what? Discomfort. Because that will help us change our misconceptions about who? About Jesus. Jesus is supposed to revolutionize our lives by making us see the world in ways that are opposed to how we normally view the world. But our lives will not be revolutionized if we always stick with what? The normal view of the world. Right? We will never be revolutionized if we also what? If we keep on viewing the world in the same way we've been viewing it. But when we meet Jesus, we're supposed to be revolutionary. Our lives are supposed to be what? Transformed. It's supposed to be changed. Now, for the most part, we want to turn Jesus into someone who, like us, right, normally views the world. But most of the time, we want him to be more like us rather than different from us. But he's actually different from us, right? I think every time we look at the Gospels, you know, we don't see ourselves there. We see someone who's not an image of ourselves. But of course, we want to create him, we want to form him into our image all the time. Because we want to make it comfortable. We want to make it easy, right? We want to make it not difficult to actually follow Jesus. But the Jesus who is different from us brings a sense of what? Discomfort. And that's what I'm going to try to actually show you, okay? Let's start with the first point, okay? If you look at verses 1 to 12, what you will see is a Jesus who was actually against a traditional religious belief, right? He was against what? A traditional religious belief. You know, what do I mean by this? Jesus acted as if he was God, right? And a lot of the Pharisees here were really what? Annoyed by that. Okay. Now, so let's look at this. You know, when you look at poor people, the weak people, the sick, the uneducated, you know, they always crave for hope, right? Wealth, they always crave for healing. They always crave for strength. They always feel very vulnerable to the tragedies of life. They cling to whatever they can actually cling on out of what? Desperation. Is that clear? Now, they have a sense of openness to whatever religious message that they actually receive. And one thing we see among religions is this. Religions tend to actually what? Exploit those vulnerabilities that people have. Am I making sense here? You know, they're sick, they want to be healed, so religion will give them what? Some kind of false hopes. They're poor, I guess, following. And then people will actually exploit that by actually telling them, if you give me money, right, somehow you will be blessed, right, so that I can buy my jet. Do you guys follow me here, right? A lot of the people who actually fall for those kind of advertisements are usually people who are poor, right? People who are like very sick, and they think that by actually giving something to the ministry of some pastors, right, they think that God will somehow bless them. But that's the problem here, right? Because, you know, a religion ought not to do that. If one intends to simply exploit the vulnerabilities of the people, then he or she offers them what? Ungrounded hopes, a superficial view of wealth, temporary healing, hollow strength. A religion that simply exploits the vulnerabilities of people is a religion that destroys the authenticity of their religiosity. Now, the reason why I'm pointing this out, because this is what we see in the paralytic person here, right? He was actually what? Vulnerable. He was what? Desperate. Now, how do we know that he was actually desperate? And the people who were actually carrying him? Because, you know, they cannot enter the house, right? Keep in mind, during that time, houses are not very big. So when it says it was full of people, it doesn't mean that there are like hundreds of people there. It's probably only like 12 people or something like that. But you know, it doesn't mean that like there was like a big crowd. So what did they do? Since they cannot enter the door, they went to the roof, right? And they opened the roof, and then that's where they actually, you know, brought him down through the roof. And that's a sense of what? Sense of desperation. And one thing you have to understand about Jesus is that he never tried to actually exploit people to, even though he saw that they have needs and he has something to give them, right? He was never what? He didn't exploit them. As a matter of fact, he always responds with some kind of what? Compassion all the time. right? He always responds with some kind of compassion. Now, so, and then one thing we saw in the text is this, that somehow Jesus saw their faith, the faith of the paralytic man and the people, because they were so eager to bring him to Jesus, that they really thought that if ever, right, if ever Jesus will actually touch this man, right, this man will actually be healed. Now, and that's the reason why Jesus said, he said, I forgive you of your sins, something like that, right? And that's very a controversial thing to do during that time. Why was that something controversial? Now, again, keep in mind when Jesus said, instead of saying, I heal you, Jesus said, I forgive you. I think there's some kind of an assumption here that probably, in some sense, sometimes sin is the cause of what? Of the sickness, in some sense, right? I don't know if that's a misconception, right? But I'm assuming probably in some cases that might be the case. Probably that was the case in this particular case with the paralytic man. But Jesus said, I forgive you of your sins. Okay? Now, why was that a controversial claim at all? Because the Pharisees made a big deal out of that. Because during that time, they believed that only God can actually what? Forgive sins. But in this particular story, Jesus claimed to have forgiven what? The sins of the paralytic man. Now, one of the things that they have to do, so for example, you can probably speak in behalf of God only if you're a priest. But Jesus was not a priest. Or at least he was not treated as a priest during his time. So for them, this was something what? Something different. He was actually forgiving someone's sins. Right? How can you do that? You're not even God. That's why they charge him of what? Blasphemy. And during that time, blasphemy is punishable by what? By death. He was supposed to get death penalty for that, right? So do you guys see someone here who's somehow rebellious or revolutionary in some sense? Right? By acting as if he is actually what? God. Okay. Second point is this. In verses 13 to 17, you will find a Jesus who was actually against a traditional religious sensibility. Traditional what? Religious sensibility. Part of the sensibility of the Pharisees is that they don't want to hang around sinners. Or quote unquote sinners. Okay. Does that make sense? Oh, thanks, Val, for this. Okay. We Christians today, we seem to have allergies in relation to like sinners. Okay. Am I correct for saying that? Yeah, we have allergies, right, in relation to sinners. We like to stay away as far away as possible from the homosexuals, right? We want to stay as far as possible from the transgendered people. We want to stay as far as possible from the illegal immigrants, right? We want to stay as far as possible from the prisoners, right? We want to stay as far as possible from the gang members, right? We want to stay as far as possible from the drug addicts, right? We want to stay as far as possible from the poor people because we accuse them of being lazy all the time, right? We want to stay as far as possible from the liberal elites, right? We want to stay as much as possible from the atheist, right? We want to stay as far as possible from the anti-Christians. We want to stay as far as possible from the Muslims, right? We want to stay as far as possible from the tattooed people. Do you guys follow me here? Right? We want to stay as far as possible from minorities, right? No, most of us are minorities here, right? We want to stay as far as possible from Don Lemon from CNN, right? Now, we want to stay as far as possible from the white supremacist. Do you guys follow me here? We are friendlier to people, usually rich men, with political clouts and powers. I hope I'm making sense here. You guys follow me here, right? And, we are friendlier to pastors who can attract large crowds and donations, right? We are friendlier to fellow Christians who can wear glamorous outfits. We are friendlier to fellow Christians who can talk in a Christianese fashion. Am I correct here? We are actually, we are friendlier to people who participate in stylish activities. And that is antithetical to everything that we see in Jesus in Mark's gospel. That's completely antithetical to that, right? Jesus mingled with the sinners. In the story here is a story about Levi, who was actually later known as what? Matthew. Okay? Right? He was probably a custom agent. Okay? And during that time, many of the religious leaders and many of the religious people actually didn't like the tax collectors. Why? Because they thought that tax collectors actually collaborated with the Romans. Right? So that's the reason why many of the people during the time of Jesus, they actually hated what? The tax collectors. They thought the tax collectors are the sinners. Right? Now, Jesus, by mingling with the sinners, behaved in a way that went against the standards of piety during his time. You're supposed to stay away from them because they are what? They're sinners. Pharisees meticulously followed what? The rules. And they do not mingle, right, with others who do not follow the rules. Okay. But Jesus mingled with the so-called sinners, or those who were what? Less religious than the Pharisees. Now, and I'm going to say something here that might sound controversial, but keep in mind, I'm not trying to just be controversial here. Okay, I'm going to say something that might sound political, but I'm not really trying to be political here, also, right? And I'll tell you why. Okay, how often do we avoid the company of sinners? We sometimes avoid to be seen with those whom we consider to be what? Sinners. Right? We're all guilty of this, I think. Or probably some of you are not, but I might be guilty of this sometimes. But without mingling with the sinners, one fails to reach out to those who need the message that we profess to what? Proclaim. Right? By failing to mingle with the sinners, we fail to serve as witnesses to them. If Jesus were alive today, he would probably be in a gay bar, right? Comforting, right, a gay person who is actually contemplating of committing suicide. Do you guys follow me here? And I'm assuming Jesus will be doing that while many Christians are whining why Jesus is actually in a gay bar. I hope I'm making sense here, right? Now, if Jesus were alive today, he would probably be at the U.S.-Mexico border right now as he comforts those parents who are actually wondering about the whereabouts of their 2-year-old children. He would probably be there right now. He would not think about the political implications of this, right? He would probably do that while some Christians are chanting on the streets, right? You are not welcome here. Follow our laws, right? But Jesus will be there actually what? Will try to comfort them. If Jesus were alive today, he would probably be in a farm in Delano as he comforts undocumented farm workers who are so worried about their potential separation from their children who are American citizens. Right? Now, he would probably do that while some Christians are praying for their immediate deportations. I hope I'm making sense here. Right? I'm not making a political claim here. I'm not talking about the government here. I'm talking about us Christians, right? I'm talking about Jesus, what Jesus will do. Now, if Jesus were alive today, he would probably confront the ignorance and insecurities of a white supremacist and show love and compassion to that person. If Jesus were alive today, he would have conversations with a prisoner, right? Who was actually neglected by his irresponsible parents when he was young, who was actually involved in using and selling drugs at a very young age, and shot another person in order to steal the person's bag. I think Jesus will be there talking to them, right? If Jesus were alive today, he would probably comfort single mom who just lost her job and is in the process of being evicted from her apartment with her 3 kids. I hope you guys are following me here, right? We're not talking about politics here. This is not politics. This is not liberalism. This is Christianity, right? we're not talking about what the government should do. That's not the care of Jesus. Jesus was not thinking about that. Okay? We're not talking about, the legal issues behind these matters. We're not talking about politics here. We are not talking about whether it is feasible to do such and such, considering the limited resources of the government. Right? Those are good discussions, political discussions. Jesus did not seem to care about such matters. For Jesus, these are not just political matters. For Jesus, these are what? Moral matters. I hope I'm making sense here. For Jesus, this is what? These are moral matters. He would be concerned about compassion and justice for such sinners. And I'm not talking about whether we should do what Jesus would have done. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm not asking you to do what I envisioned Jesus would have done if he was here, if he were here. I am talking about what Jesus would have done if he were alive today. Because I'm trying to paint a picture of Jesus that is actually completely different from how we keep on thinking about Jesus. Right? When you allow politics to consume every aspect of morality, you begin to downplay the value of compassion. You begin to downplay the value of justice. Right? In your own personal dealings with other people. Again, we're not talking about politics here. We're talking about morality. We're talking about spirituality. Right? Jesus probably will not care about, what the politicians are actually discussing about what to do with such immigrants. But what he will do is that he will go out there and help them out. That's it. Irrespective of what the politicians end up, irrespective of what they end up, the laws that they actually pass. Okay? Now, always keep this in mind. I read this from a book of a Christian mystic. His name is Morton Kelsey. And I actually put it on my other Bible. I have a Bible, and then I put some quotes. I wrote some favorite quotes that I read in the past. And this is what he said. The church is not a museum for saints, but a hospital for sinners. Right? The church is not a museum for what? Saints, but a hospital for what? For sinners. So I hope we get Jesus here, right? We have a Jesus here who is actually what? Against some of our religious sensibilities. Right? Part of our religious sensibilities is to stay away from the sinners. But that's not what Jesus did. Okay. So let's look at the next one. So we're almost done. Okay. Third point. In verses 18 to 22, what we have is a Jesus who is actually against a traditional religious practice. Now, Jesus did not strictly follow religious rituals. Jesus did not what? Strictly follow religious rituals. Now, fasting was part of a religious practice of the Jews. Okay, so they're required to fast on the Day of Atonement. But the thing with the Pharisees is that they fast more often than other people. Okay, they like to go fasting, right? Right, because part of the tradition of the Jews is that you have to if it's the wedding feast, right? So you should not be fasting or mourning for 7 days. So Jesus says, once the bridegroom is gone, right, then they will actually what? They will actually fast, right? Because again, he's talking about himself as what? As the bridegroom here. And then Jesus started talking about the old, the wineskin and the wine, right? You know what happened when you have a wineskin? That's where you put the wine, right? And after washing it several times, it shrunk. It usually shrinks, right? And then what happened is the more you put new wine, right? It begins to expand, and then at some point it actually what? Explodes, right? Or it breaks, right? Now, so I think what Jesus was saying when he said that is that he was actually poking fun at the strict religiosities of the Pharisees. Okay, he was not doing it directly, but he was doing it what? Indirectly. Okay, Pharisees were performing religious activities more than what they need to. Okay, they're overdoing religious activities, so for example, they will fast more often than other people. And what Jesus is saying here is something like this. Okay, let me put it this way. Jesus said, in a way saying, if you're doing this over and over again, like fasting, with this old ways of thinking and old ways of living, according to Jesus, eventually it will what? It will burst, right? That's why, according to Jesus, what you need is what? A new wineskin. Now, one thing I want you to see here is that Jesus understood what he was trying to do. He was introducing something new. A new way of thinking. He was introducing a new way of what? Of doing things. That's what he was doing. Okay? Jesus seemed to be aware that he was introducing something new. He was pointing out something about the limitations and temporariness of the efficacies of what? Those religious rituals. Now, religious rituals for Jesus were not ends in themselves, while for the Pharisees, they became ends in themselves. Right? Now, the rituals, this is what happened to us, right? What happened is that at some point, we begin to view rituals as what? As an end in itself. We forget to realize that the rituals are just simply means to what? To an end. Going to church is a ritual. Do you guys follow me here? But sometimes we think that the end is just, as long as you're in church, you're okay. But again, we begin to think that because it became what? A habit. And we become uncomfortable when we fail to go to church. We feel guilty when we fail to go to church. Why? Because it's a ritual. Do you guys follow me? It's a ritual. Now, religious rituals, through constant repetitions, at some point, they become what? Established practices. At some point, they become practices that one ought to do. Yeah, because you're doing it all the time, and then it becomes what? You ought to do this. You ought to do this now, right? This is it. We've been doing this all the time. Now, the habit of practicing them manages to fool us into thinking that they ought to be done, and we need to do them more often. Now, we forget that the rituals of a particular generation are merely a byproduct of that particular time. If you notice, rituals, they do what? They do change. Do you guys follow me here? They do change. Rituals, they do change. Right? They don't have lasting significance. If you probably watch how the Christians gather 1,500 years ago, you'll be surprised that they didn't gather the way we're actually what? Gathering now. Okay, it'll be a completely different thing, right? They have different set of what? Of rituals, different from ours. Okay, rituals do not outlive the ways of thinking that gave rise to them. And since ways of thinking change, the rituals also what? They also change, right? Once, a way of thinking becomes obsolete, what happens? The rituals that correspond to them also becomes what? They also lose their value. They lose their significance. Ways of thinking are doomed to what? Fade. So religious rituals are probably essential for sustaining them, but at some point, those religious rituals will actually what? Will fade. I hope I'm making sense here. Now, Jesus was aware that he was ushering a new way of thinking and a new way of living. And in the period of transition, there's always going to be a clash between what? The old way of thinking and the new way of thinking. There's always going to be like that. And that's the reason why that's what happened here. There was a clash between who? The Pharisees as the one who represent what? The old ways of thinking. And then Jesus as the one who represent a new way of thinking. Right. Do you guys follow me here? Right. There's nothing wrong with the new. The new simply brings temporary discomfort. There must be birth pains at the beginning of the new. And this is what happened in the time of Jesus, right? They were experiencing the birth pains because he was trying to introduce something new. He was ushering to this transition into what? A new way of thinking, a new way of living. I hope you guys are following me here, right? Last point. Against a traditional religious law. You guys know that Jesus was a lawbreaker. Jesus was what?
A lawbreaker.
A lawbreaker, right? Jesus was not questioning the law. Rather, he was challenging the standard understanding of the law. Keep this in mind. Human needs override standard religious rules. Human needs override what? Standard religious rules. Standard religious rules are not ends in themselves. They are not valuable in themselves. Again, we're talking about because in the story here, remember it's about observing Sabbath, right? That was actually that's part of the story here about the observance of Sabbath, right? But somehow, one thing you see here in Jesus is that he actually broke that particular, the law, right? You're supposed to observe Sabbath. You're not supposed to, pick up grains, right, on Sabbath day. But Jesus and his disciples did it, right? Okay. And the Pharisees got mad, right? Because why are you guys doing that, right? You're not supposed to do that on this day because it's Sabbath day. Now, keep this in mind. Humans are more valuable than the laws. Right? Humans are more valuable than what? The rules. The standard religious rules. Humans are much more valuable than church buildings. Right? Humans are much more valuable than church programs. Again, you have to understand what's happening right now, right? In many churches, the buildings are, of course, much more important than what? The humans. Right? The church programs are actually much more important than what? The humans. Humans are much more valuable than religious rituals. The problem here is the problem with what? Legalism. Because legalism puts the law above what? Humans. Do you guys follow me here? Legalism puts what? The law above humans. But the law is created for humans, right? Not humans for the law. Okay. This is what Jesus actually said, right? The law was created for what? For humans, not humans for what? For the law. The law is created to serve the spiritual, moral, social, personal needs of humans. And if the law is in the way of meeting such needs, then you need to set aside the law in order to meet what? The needs. Because who has priority here? It's not the law, but it's what? The humans. I hope you guys are following me here. Right? If humans have priority over the law, then Jesus has priority over the law. That's why Jesus is what? Lord of the Sabbath. Okay? He's the Lord, is even the Lord of what? The Sabbath day. So let me conclude here. Jesus showed us that things do not need to be the way they always had been. Okay? I hope that's clear. Things do not need to be what? The way they always had been. Religious activities that were done the way they always had been done bring staleness and dullness to the activities. They make the activities what? Ineffective. Religious beliefs do not need to be static. They can also be what? Dynamic. They do what? They do change. You guys know that, right? The Christians 1,000 years ago do not believe the same thing we believe now. Okay? It's changing. Knowledge of what is true cannot be contained by the finite perspective of a particular generation. Each generation has what? A finite perspective, right? So each generation cannot have the monopoly of what is of when it comes to what is true. Do you guys follow me here? It changes, right? Openness to the unveiling of further truths about God is better than being stuck in the very narrow perspective of the past. And again, we see this in Jesus, right? That's why, what happened is that we get stuck to what? To those narrow teachings of the past. We fail to think that, there's probably more things that we can know about God. But the problem is that we lack that openness. religious authorities are not always right in their religious judgments. I hope I'm making sense. I'm not trying to ask you to rebel against religious authorities. I'm simply claiming that sometimes they are what? Sometimes they're wrong about things. They can be mistaken. Now, one thing that you have to keep in mind here is this. And again, this might sound political, but this is not in a political sense, okay? In a contemporary sense. Jesus was not a religious conservative from the standpoint of his contemporaries. He was not what? He was not a religious conservative. A religious conservative is someone who preserves the traditional or old ways of thinking and doing things. But Jesus challenged the traditional belief about God by acting as if he was God. Right? Jesus offended the bearers of the religious traditionalism of his day by mingling with the sinners. Jesus refrained from practicing a traditional religious practice, such as fasting on a particular day. Jesus even broke traditional law, right? A law about the observance of the Sabbath. In order for Jesus to introduce a new way of thinking or living, Jesus must rebel against the traditional ways of thinking and living. He has to rebel against those things. He directly confronted the bearers of such ways of thinking and living. I'm talking about the Pharisees here. I think that humans create ways of thinking that eventually enslave them. Do you guys follow me when I said that? We create ways of thinking that eventually what? That eventually enslave us. Why? Because legalism always managed to what? Creeps into, it creeps into our lives, right? Because this is part of some kind of a, natural way of thinking. We become legalistic after a while. Okay. Now, we have to constantly resist legalistic tendencies. We have to what? Constantly resist legalistic what? Tendencies. Our legalistic tendencies blind us from the truth. Such tendencies prevent the progress in our spiritual growth, our spiritual maturity, and our independence. Do you guys follow me here when I said that? Now, they make us close-minded. That's what happens, right? Legalism makes us what? Close-minded. Considering our proneness to legalism, all of us are prone to legalism, okay? I think including myself. I include myself there. All of us have that kind of proneness to legalism. Considering our proneness to legalism as part of the natural patterns of our behaviors, we are always called to go against the grain. Right? Because we have that natural tendency. That's why we always need to figure out a way how to what? Go against the grain in some sense. Considering that our world is naturally prone to greediness and self-centeredness, that's why we're always called to go against what? The grain. The natural world is always going a certain way, but we're always trying to go what? Against the grain. Right? Considering that our history is naturally prone to do away with God, we are also always called to go against what? The grain. Right? So my suggestion is this. Follow Jesus by going against what? The grain.